Good afternoon, good morning. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report. Last week we started a discussion on the courageous conversation. It's a conversation that very few people want to have, and that conversation surrounds the use of force and police and the fact that our politicians, quite frankly, media and activists are using race to divide this nation, and they're using police use of force as that vehicle to do so. So last week we ended with a analysis of work that has been done by Professor Darrell Ross. He wrote a textbook called Civil Liability and Criminal Justice, and you can find that on Kindle. And we left last week talking about a study done by Hickman and several of his associates in 2008. And that study stated that, well, I'll give you the what they were going to look at, then I'll give you the findings. The study was performed a comparative analysis of the findings of 36 published studies regarding the nature of the police use of less lethal force covering the period of 1980 to 2008. This is kind of really important, folks, because you have politicians in Olympia right now debating if they're going to take less lethal force away from your law enforcement. And they want to take armored vehicles away from your law enforcement. They want to take tear gas away from your law enforcement. They want to take any less lethal force that we have to break up a riot away from police officers. In my opinion, the reason they want to do that is so people can riot. And what they failed to realize is when you start taking away less lethal force, what you've left us with is lethal force. When you take away armor, you take away our ability to negotiate with somebody and to get, let's say, we need to put a phone in a house so we can talk with them. That's how we do that. We do that with armor. And, you know, they've made this big deal about armor and how we've been militarized. Your law enforcement has not been militarized. That is another myth. And it has been brought forward by, quite frankly, activists, politicians, and conveyed by the media. It's just not happening. But beware. Beware when you take away less lethal force, because what you've left us with is lethal force to stop lawlessness. That is just so counterintuitive. What Hickman found in his study was they concluded that the police use of force is rare in citizen contacts, which reinforced prior study findings reported since the 1960s. Roughly 1% to 2% of our contacts result in force. The likelihood that police will use any force increases to 20% during the course of effecting an arrest. And that just happens to be one of the most dangerous acts that we do, is arresting somebody. So a citizen contact, your chance of having your force used, and that is force or threatened use of force, is 1% to 2% of the time. If we're arresting you and you resist, that's where the 20% use of force comes into when we're effecting an arrest. So race and use of force. Dr. Ross continues and makes this statement. There has been a considerable amount of research concerning race/ethnicity, and the empirical data is mixed at best in this area. Several studies have found that race, ethnicity did not influence the likelihood of an officer using force during an encounter. Did you catch that? Several studies have found that race, ethnicity did not influence the likelihood of an officer using force during an encounter. kind of flies in the face of President-elect Biden's statement that had this been BLM to charge the Capitol, it would have been different. It goes on to state that despite the strong evidence that race and ethnicity does not play a significant role in police use of force, there are studies that did find a correlation. Now, some people are going, aha, Sheriff, there are studies that did find a correlation. Well, let's find out what that actually is. Because Ross goes on and states, however, in some of these studies, when neighborhood contextual factors were taken into consideration, the race, ethnicity of the suspect no longer played a role. So the actual demographic of the neighborhood and the contextual factors eliminated race from that. And that was a study that was done by Khalif and Tyler in 2010. What does the science say? It says race and use of force aren't really corollary. Again, flies in the face of the statements made by the president-elect. There was a study conducted at Washington State University, that found police officers were more likely to hesitate in using deadly force on African-American suspects when they encountered a deadly force situation that was justified. Now, I remember when this study came out, I remember the pushback that they received. That study was actually done by professors that I know. They're in the Spokane area, and it was amazing to see that pushback. That study went on to state that the study's findings related. Finally, in one of the experiments, participants were significantly more likely to fail to shoot armed Black suspects than white or Hispanic suspects. In sum, the participants in this experiment showed significant evidence of bias favoring Black suspects rather than discriminating against them. And that was a study that was conducted in 2012 by Lois James, Professor Vila, and Arthur. Again, that's a local study. And they replicated that study multiple times because of the pushback they received when they first put that study out. I've followed the study for many years now. So when you take a look at race and use of force, the findings of the Washington State study complement an article compiled by the Legal and Liability Risk Management Institute, which was written by Professor Richard Johnson. So in this article, Professor Johnson explored the question of death related to police use of force using a fairly unique concept. And Professor Johnson compared the number of police officers killed and assaulted to the number of times police actually used deadly force in these encounters. So he actually looked at the number of times we are faced with deadly force situations. He also compared this data to encounters involving African-American males. African-American males are approximately 6% of the population. So what did this study find? That in reports compiled by the FBI over a 10-year period from 2003 to 2012, there were roughly 500,000 reported felonious assaults against police officers, of which about 191,000, 31%, involved a weapon of some sort. I rounded those numbers up for Those of you that are viewing the podcast, for those of you that are listening on the radio, those numbers are rounded. So when we take a look at the study, he continued, and his findings indicated that on average there were 3,277 deadly weapon assaults on police officers per year. So your police officers are assaulted with a deadly weapon 3,277 times a year per study. What does that mean? Well, it means that each year police officers would have been justified in using deadly force 3,277 times. Now, what actually happened? What actually happened each year when we are faced with 3,277 times that somebody is using a weapon against us? What happens? Well, of the suspects who murdered police officers, 44% of them were African American males. Based on the number of knife and gun assaults on police per year, and the fact that African American males killed 44% of police officers, Johnson concluded that it would have been reasonable to expect the following: that we would have used lethal force 3,277 times, and we would have used lethal force against African American males 1,452 times every year. That's what the study would dictate, that based on the number of times we were assaulted by a knife or a gun, and the fact that 44% of those times we would be dealing with an African American male, we would have been justified in using lethal force over 3,000 times, and been justified to use lethal force against African American males over 1,000 times, almost 1,500 times. Johnson didn't just stop at the FBI's numbers. He also looked into the Center of Disease Control and looked at their data on legal interventions. And over that same 10-year period between 2003 and 2012, the CDC recorded 4,285 deaths resulting from legal interventions. Of these deaths, 1,127, 26% were African American males. Based on this data, there was an average of 429 deaths due to police deadly force every year during this time period, and with 113 of them being African American males, roughly 25%. 25% when the African American males are responsible for 44% of lethal use of force against law enforcement officers. So what did Johnson find? Based on the above data and comparing the variables mentioned, he found that only 13% of the situations in which officers are legally justified in using lethal force result in a citizen's death. So we use force 13% of the time when we are legally justified to do so. Only 8% of those situations in which we are involved in a legally justified use of force, that use of force was against an African American. That resulted in death. 8%. So going back, while African American men make up 44% of the assailants against police, they only make up 26% of the deaths from legal interventions. Not exactly what you've been told all this time. Johnson concluded his report by stating, official data verified by the FBI and the CDC reveal that deaths from use of force by law enforcement are relatively rare. The evidence reveals that circumstances permitting legal and justified use of force, use of lethal force by law enforcement officers occur thousands of times annually, yet less than 500 die annually from police use of force. The evidence revealed while almost half of those killed by police officers are African American men, only about a quarter of those who die from police use of force are African American men. So the evidence says that while almost half of the police officers who die are killed by African American men, only a quarter of those who die from police use of force are African American men. And finally, all of this evidence is publicly available online for any agency, news outlet, or community activist group to examine. Why haven't they? Dr. Johnson just pointed it out. The study was done in 2015, a year after Ferguson. Why haven't the politicians, the media, and activists looked at this data? Because it doesn't fit the narrative. It just doesn't fit the narrative that police are biased, and we're biased against African American men. And we, to quote a local African American leader activist, we kill African American, we being police, African Americans so frequently that he fears leaving his house. I don't understand that. And quite frankly, I know this individual. I respect this individual, and I almost, well, I was kind of heartbroken to hear him say that, because that's not what happens. It surely doesn't happen here, and it surely doesn't happen involving the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. It just doesn't. So there are some media outlets that have talked about this issue. This article is titled Myth of Systemic Police Racism. It was done by Heather McDonald with the Wall Street Journal in June of last year. And this is what she found in her studies. A police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black male than unarmed black males is to be killed by a police officer. So police officers are 18.5 times more likely to be killed by an African American male than an African American male unarmed is to be killed by a police officer. Again, it doesn't fit the narrative now, does it? McDonald goes on to state that this charge of systemic police bias was wrong during the Obama years and remains wrong today. However, sickening the video of George Floyd's arrest, and it was, folks, there was no justification for what happened to Mr. Floyd. That is a time that we really just got it wrong. And it was a travesty. There's no excuse for it. But McDonald goes on to state that it isn't representative of the 375 million annual contacts that police officers have with civilians. And it's not. So in 2020, you had one contact out of 375 million contacts that we have with you, the citizen, that went horribly wrong. One. There is a solid body of evidence that finds no structural bias in the criminal justice system. And this is something that is totally counter to what the media, activists, and politicians want you to believe. There's systemic structural bias. Okay, here's a challenge. Will you, somebody please come to the sheriff's office, take a look at my policies and procedures, take a look at the local laws, take a look at the state laws, take a look at the national laws, and tell me how anyone would survive being systemic racist or biased in today's worlds based on policies, laws, and everything else. As a matter of fact, if I operated the sheriff's office that way, I would probably go to jail, most likely would go to jail. There is no systemic racism. Matter of fact, the system is structured so it cannot happen. And if it does happen, those who do it are punished, and punished severely. So why do we continue with the rhetoric? Because race is being used to divide this nation. That's why. McDonald makes it very clear. A solid body of evidence finds no structural bias in the criminal justice system with regard to arrest, prosecutions, or sentencing. Now, I can hear the activists screaming right now, but Sheriff, you arrest 6% of the arrests that you make are of African-American males. Well, that's true, 6% are. But that's not right, that's not fair, because we represent roughly 1.7% of the population of Spokane County. Well, folks, I don't live in utopia. And there are outside forces that are in play that African Americans are committing 6% of the crime. And again, I don't live in utopia. I can't fix that. That is there are economic pressures. Quite frankly, there are family structural problems. There are all kinds of issues that feed into that. The gang reality is part of that. That's why I was asked by one of our local African-American leaders to, Sheriff, we need to find a way to break the cycle. We need to find a way to get these kids jobs. And that's why I and a great woman by the name of Judith Gilmore work really hard to create an apprenticeship program that if you go to this apprenticeship program, we will get you jobs in the construction field. We did that. Why? Because we need to break that cycle of violence. Those are the truths. And the NAACP came and looked at our arrests, and that's where that number 6% came from, was that study done by Dr. Burns out of Eastern Washington University. And that study shows that there are only 2 demographics in Spokane County that are not representative of their, quote, population demographic. That would be African Americans and Native Americans, indigenous people. All others are below their demographics as far as arrests. So I asked this question of Dr. Burns, and I asked this question of the NAACP. Are you telling me that we are only biased against 2 demographics? That doesn't make any sense, because it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't. There are different pressures that are responsible. It is not police bias. McDonald finishes that crime and suspect behavior, not race. And there you go, folks. Crime and suspect behavior, not race, determines most police actions. And that is spot on. We don't go and make things up. I mean, if it's a homicide, that's not us being proactive, that's us responding. And I can't help that homicide was created by, or was committed by, somebody of color. I can't help that. That's just reality. McDonald goes on to state that, you know, and I agree with this statement 100%, folks. This next statement, I 100% agree, and you've seen me do it. I have terminated 76 people from the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. You've watched me do this. McDonald says, hold officers accountable who use excessive force, but there is no evidence of widespread racial bias, and there isn't. In 2018, the latest year of which data has been published, African Americans made up 53% of the known homicide offenders in the United States, and we should just change that because if you really look at it, it's predominantly African American males commit 53% of the known homicides in the United States in 2018, and committed 60% of the robberies. Though they represent 13% of the population. Well, that 13% is African American male predominantly, so it's roughly 6% of the population. So 6% of the population commits 53% of the homicides. Here's a more tragic aspect to those numbers. Ones that no one wants to talk about. These politicians don't want to talk about it. Last politician to talk about it was President Obama. He was spot on. Spot on. Because 52% of the victims of homicides in the United States, victims of homicides, are predominantly African American male, 18 to 25 years old. That is a travesty. And I, for once, would love to have an African American leader, an African American activist, or an activist, or a politician join me in condemning that, and join me in trying to fix that. That is the true travesty here, folks. This is a travesty. When you have 52% of your victims of homicide being African American males, 18 to 25, somebody should be screaming at the top of their lungs about that. Next week, we will do part 3 of this series, and we will continue with the myths of systemic police racism. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report. Have a great day.